The West is the best. There's something bad. Get in, we'll do the rest. The blue is calling. Travel where we take it on. The killer awoke before dawn. He put his boots on. He took a face from the ancient gallery and he walked on down the hall. He went into the room where his sister lived and then he...
All right, thank you for those of you who, a couple others besides Sarah and Eamon volunteered to watch Roy this weekend. I really appreciate that. And Sarah's going to take care of it. She's going to handle it. I'll be on from Friday morning until Monday afternoon, Sarah, all right? Friday morning till Monday. And it doesn't have to be real early because I've got someone else. I have to be at the airport by about 9 o'clock, 9:30 or so, and that might be a little too early. But I've got somebody else who's going to come to campus. And anyway, just talk to me after class. We'll figure out exactly when we'll meet on Friday, tomorrow morning. All right? Thank you, Sarah. All right. And I will have to then send out, before I leave tonight, I'll have to send out your midterms. And I try to do something a little creative and different every term. And for some reason, I think we might have, I figured I'd type up three moral struggles. And two of them are inspired by our question in the back, the guy that asked about, I'm not sure if he's here today, the guy that asked about moral responsibilities to restore if such technology becomes possible, for example, the thylacine or the passenger pigeon. So I figured I'd take those two. And I'd just create, do this little narrative on each one of them that says, some guy in some valley in Wisconsin has, got 100 passenger pigeons ready to release. He's mastered the genetics, he's had this secret project the whole time. And anyway, and then there'll be some dollar of figures on there, that affect agriculture, right? It'll be so many millions of dollars to agriculture if these guys are released, right? And that'll be your moral struggle. Should Joe Smith release his genetically engineered 100 passenger pigeons? Anyway, and with each moral struggle, you'll basically be asked to confront economic issues versus ecological issues, all right? Because that's kind of the, that's the rudimentary question we're confronting in the first 3 weeks of the class, okay? And specifically, ecology versus economy, just from an anthropocentric perspective, all right? And don't overthink the simple Leopoldian framework that we've covered so far. And don't overthink conservationism either, and utilitarianism. Okay? You guys should be able to give me a Leopoldian explanation for why, for example, we ought to introduce thylacines to the anthropocentric argument is always that ecological holes, right, I went over this as simply as I could on Tuesday. Ecological holes are instrumentally valuable, extremely instrumentally valuable to the future well-being of human communities, okay? And furthermore, and that's a lesson we learned from ecology, right? And it's just a consequentialist argument. If we do X, we know what's going to happen, and many of the things that are going to happen are very bad for the long-term interests of human society. Okay, so we don't want to do X, which damages the integrity, anything that damages the integrity, stability, or beauty of the whole. Damages the whole, right? And wholes are instrumentally valuable to the long-term human interests of human communities, right? And furthermore, ecology instructs us, teaches us that every member, and by that we mean species, right? We don't mean individual animals. We mean species, okay? Every member of the biotic community, not just species, but also the hydrological cycle, water, the climate systems, right? All the things that species depend on to be stable and to be integrated, right? So they can continue manifesting themselves and their genetic lineage, right? Across a long period of time. So all members we know, out of caution, we know because we know our knowledge is fallible. And we don't know what role each member of the biotic community plays, right? And so we don't know if discarding willy-nilly fellow members of the crew, right, is how Leopold describes it. We don't know what the consequence of that is going to be, and we don't want to we want to err on the side of caution, and so an intelligent tinkerer saves all the parts, right? And that's the anthropocentric argument, and that's as much as you need to know so far about the Leopoldian land management framework, okay? And then, right, there are the group A's and the group B's, right? And then the difference is that they emphasize different, right? The group B's do have this moment that transcends anthropocentrism, but ignore that, all right? Remember the group B's have this trapdoor in their framework that leads off their reservation, into Narnia or something like that. But ignore the trapdoor. You guys haven't discovered it yet, okay? So for you guys, so far, the difference between the group A's and the group B's is that the group B's emphasize a different set of values, all right? Different set of anthropocentric values, right? The group B's emphasize ecological values. The group B's emphasize things like, the forest serves us by filtering our water, filtering our air, right? All this, the biodiversity serves us because we don't know which one of these animals is going to prove to be extremely useful for food or for fuel or for clothing or something in the future, right? But those are all anthropocentric arguments for our limited interpretation of group B conservationism, okay? It's just convenient, right? We want to have convenient concepts to hang our thinking on, right? To swing through the ideas that we're covering. And it's just very helpful to think of conservationism as an inherently, unavoidably anthropocentric philosophy, all right? Even though, right, and then it's not really, at a cultural level, it's not until the mid-60s or so, with many different countercultural movements emerging, it's not really until the mid-60s that conservationism becomes environmentalism, or the ecology movement, which does clearly have some very strong non-anthropocentric features. Okay? But for our purposes, and historically, conservationism emerged in a fully anthropocentric framework. It was all about saving places because they're beautiful, or using things like rivers because they're incredibly useful to generate electricity, right, etc. All right. So we'll have one hypothetical scenario where this secret project in Valley in Wisconsin is all set. I'll have to figure all this out. Hopefully I won't hit any big stumbling blocks. But now I've committed myself to it, and I'll ask you to answer 2 out of 3. Okay? And for each moral struggle, I'll ask you to give me 2 out of 3 traditional answers. All right? Because we're only covering 3, right? Wise use, group A, group B. Right? Those are our 3 resource management frameworks that I'm going to ask you to apply to 2 of the 3 moral struggles that I present. Right? And the third one, I only learned about a month ago about these rogue salmon farm escapees in the 90s and 80s, I guess. It's an amazing story. If you ask me, it's kind of fascinating. So I thought I'd pick out one of those watersheds down there in Argentina or Chile and ask you guys to, again, apply. And again, this time it's kind of a different factual situation because rather than reintroducing a species that was wiped out, 80 years ago or whatever, a thylacine or a passenger pigeon. Now I'm asking you to consider, right, an economically valuable species, right? Those state governments down there in southern Argentina and southern Chile, they like those salmon because they generate revenue, right, for the tourism industry. But ecologically, right? We don't know because there hasn't been any study at all. But ecologically, we should suspect that perhaps those are invasive exotic species down there and they shouldn't be there because they're eating some of the food. They're relying on the same resources that the penguins specifically, maybe other animals, are relying on. If the penguins are economically not valuable, right? So what would a Leopoldian say to that? What would a Group A Leopoldian say? You know, is it morally wrong? Should this state government in Chile eradicate the invasive Chinook that's nativized on its watershed? Right? What would a Group A Leopoldian say? So those are the three moral struggles I'll ask you to consider, and I'll ask you to apply on each of those. Two of those three you'll have to pick, and of those two of three you'll have to apply two. You know, in one instance maybe with the Chinook, I'll ask you to consider a wise use perspective and a Group B perspective. And then with thylacines in Tasmania, the thylacine reintroduction project, you know, again, there'll be a certain dollar amount of damages that'll be caused by these thylacines, right? And your job will be to compare, as a resource manager, the importance of those economic considerations, which are negative, right? Big economic impact on the sheep farmers and whatnot in Tasmania, versus the ecological benefits, right? That a Group B conservationist is going to champion, right? Tremendous ecological benefits to the reintroduction of these apex predators. All right, so anyway, anyone have any questions about that? All right, so I'll send it out, I'll type it up, and I'll send it out as an attachment to an email later today, all right, before I go home this evening, all right? So you'll get that, and you'll have all weekend to work on it, and just work on it and bring it back on Tuesday to turn it in, okay? And I'll put one of the biggest, one of the things to worry about and to be warned about is you might know the material, but you got to explain all of it, right? As much as possible to me. You have to write your answers as though I don't know anything about philosophy, all right? Because you have to show me that you understand it. And it's far more than just applying the rules, right? It's not just, okay, this tradition generates rules, now let's apply it, blah, and move on, right? No, you have to explain where the rules come from and why the resource manager, from his ethical education has reached, that conclusion about the nature of value, for example, right? So, anyway. All right, since you don't have any questions, we'll just move on. I'm not sure if there's probably a lot of Schweitzer that I left out. My lectures seem to be moving more slowly than they were last term. I don't know why. We closed off with the consideration of meta-ethical objectivism, which rears its head throughout the study of environmental ethics. Right? It's a basic conflict. That's the basic meta-ethical conflict. Anthropocentric ethicists tend to be consequentialists, and they tend to be meta-ethical subjectivists. Right? Value in natural resources only occurs as a consequence of humans coming along and doing their valuing thing, right? And so we can only judge which valuing act is better or worse with reference to the human beings valuing things, right? The consequences of human beings valuing things. So, anyway, the meta-ethical objectivist is typically a more than anthropocentrist. And sure enough, Schweitzer is a more than anthropocentric individualist, right? That's his axiological orientation. Now his normative theory, remember each of these three that I'm asking, each of his is different. You don't have to worry about Schweitzer for the midterm, but remember, we're all term long, we're constructing environmental ethics, right? And environmental ethics consists of two components, an axiological orientation and a normative theory, right? So we know what Schweitzer's axiological orientation is. He's an objectivist, and he's going to be he's a more than anthropocentric more than anthropocentric individualist, right? And that's different. That's a very different position than the meta-ethical holist, right? The ecocentrist is the holist. The biocentrist is the individualist, right? But they're both more than anthropocentrists, all right? Now, what about Schweitzer's normative theory? And here's where there's some controversy, and here's where there's some room for interpretation and interpolation, and trying to just kind of scratch your head and trying to figure out what this doctor, he's a medical doctor for crying out loud. He's not even a professional theologian, let alone a professional philosopher. He's a doctor, and he's writing kind of as an amateur, but he's spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff, right? And he's written an essay that's lasted and that is, still to this day considered to be an incredibly important contribution to the debate about how human beings ought to relate to the environment, to more than, to the more than human world. But what exactly, so I take the liberty. Schweitzer would get up on his hind legs and object, especially if you look at the end of his essay. He seems to hold up David Hume. The Enlightenment, right, the conflict, the 18th century conflict between the Scottish Enlightenment and the German Enlightenment. The Scottish Enlightenment are the consequentialists, the Humeans, right? German Enlightenment are the non-consequentialists, the rigorous German, Immanuel Kant, right? And I have presented, and I will defend it now. I have defended the idea that Schweitzer should be considered a neo-Kantian and not a neo-Humean, even though he holds up David Hume's work at the very end of his essay as being a better model for how morality works, right? And certainly if you, like Schweitzer, want to think and do think about non-human animals like the sparrows, right, who leave the crumbs for their injured friend, or the adopted parents of the orphan monkeys, right, the other monkeys that adopt them, or the geese. That was my favorite story of all. The ignorant gardener. Okay, I'll just clip I like this goose, I'm going to clip his wings so he hangs out longer, right? And then it's time for him to leave, and he can't go because his wings don't let him fly, because his feathers have all been cut off. And so what do his friends do? Do they fly off? No, they come back and they wait. They wait a few weeks, they wait for his feathers to grow, and then they all leave together, right? So, and Schweitzer says that's an example of morality, of moral behavior in more than human animals. And so Schweitzer obviously is going to disagree with Kant about the source of morality being human reason, right? So the way I think about this is that Schweitzer articulates a universal rule, a principle, right? And you can formulate that, I take liberties perhaps, but I formulate that principle for your purposes as a rudimentary level, the survey course, as sort of like Kant's category. I just replaced some of the words. Kant's categorical imperative, right, the great humanist formula, is treat the humanity in oneself and others, always as an end, right? Because there's no other way to think the thought human being without thinking end in itself, and not impossible, metaphysically impossible to reduce to an instrument, right? Metaphysical status of the human being is so special that any action which results in the reduction of that human end in itself to an instrument for someone else's ends is morally impermissible, okay? So Kant says treat the humanity in oneself, don't objectify and instrumentalize and reduce yourself, and in others, don't do that to other people, don't use people, right? Always as an end and never solely as a means, right? We treat each other as ends, from time to time, and that's okay, right? When we go shopping, we want the clerk to, we use the clerk to do our transaction, right? But we never reduce, right? It's the reduction that brings about the morally, right? The moral wrong, okay? So what Schweitzer really, one way to understand Schweitzer, and the way I encourage you to understand is what he's saying, what he's doing is he's replacing the word humanity in that formula with the word life, right? And he's offering us a much broader understanding of our inherent absolute commitments, moral obligations, that is, what are, right? Which is what Kant wants to do, right? Which is what Kant offers us. Not hypothetical imperatives, right? Kant says, woe to those who creep through the serpent windings of utilitarianism, right? Remember that, think about that, and I'll quote that again. But that's Kant's big rebuttal to consequentialist thinking. It's all hypothetical. And once you travel too far down the road of hypothetical imperatives, you find yourself doing things that are morally deeply problematic, right? You have a hypothetical imperative to extract information from that terrorist, and by golly, you're going to do it, whether it involves torturing his daughter or not, right? That's gone quite a ways down the serpent windings of utilitarianism and gotten yourself into some very deeply morally problematic territory, right? According to Kant. Anyway, but what Schweitzer does is he kind of turns this moral imperative of not instrumentalizing it, he interprets that as not only the result of reflection, of careful human reflection, that only humans can do, right? We're the only ones with cognitive apparatuses sophisticated enough to think these thoughts, right? But he says all beings, all living beings, at a genetic level, really, I think maybe that's what he's saying. At this physical level, they share what we understand, intellectually, conceptually. They share this same basic idea, right? So it's not a consequentialist argument, right? He's saying that biology teaches us that every living thing is awesome. And sure, in order to live, we must take life. So that means sometimes we do instrumentalize, reduce things all the way down, right? But we can do that still with a sense of respect, right? I think that's what he's saying. All right. So there's this issue of the naturalistic fallacy, and I haven't talked really about that yet. But the natural law theorists are most guilty of committing the naturalistic fallacy. And this is where my little primitive drawing of the two cliffs, right, and like the gulf between empirical statements and normative statements, this is where it comes in handy again, that little drawing. Because those who commit the naturalistic fallacy want to say that that we can derive normative claims from an account of facts by recognizing that the facts include design, right, imparted by some kind of higher power, and from understanding the design of a thing in nature, we can learn how we ought to, right? We can make a normative claim about how we ought to treat that thing in nature. So, Schweitzer kind of, now I don't know if he uses this term, it's a term maybe I take too many liberties with Schweitzer, but it seems to me what he's saying is that there are value facts in nature, right? And that's problematic, right? I mean, this is the whole puzzle of Enlightenment moral philosophy, right? We are no longer allowed. At a cultural level, the Enlightenment is really a response to the political and economic power of the Catholic Church. Okay? And there's an effort among intellectuals to free themselves from that. And in moral philosophy, that effort manifests itself as, first of all, in the recognition that all the moral claims that are being tossed around so freely in the 18th, 17th, and 18th centuries are predicated on this view that somehow everything is in God, right? Somehow everything is created by God, and everything has a telos, a purpose, right? And so, and an Enlightenment moral philosopher comes along and says, well, all these moral claims being made, and yet there is never any mention of how these moral claims are derived from an understanding of the facts, right? And as Enlightenment thinkers, that's what we're seeking. We're seeking an understanding of the universe that's based on an empirical observation of what's going on, right? And you can't just assert that everything in nature has a design, right? That's a metaphysical commitment that as an Enlightenment thinker you can't make anymore, right? And sure enough, Darwin comes along in the middle of the 19th century and just demolishes, right? Just routs the natural law theorists because he demolishes the teleological basis of their whole theory, right? If there's nothing teleological in evolution, for example, which is what Darwinists say, then the whole claim that we can read the normative claim out of the purpose, right? There is no purpose. There is no telos. So where do we get our moral claims? At that point, some people who really rely on that kind of thinking just throw up their hands and say, well, now it's nihilism. Everything is permitted, right? But we know better than that. We know a lot better than that. Because Enlightenment thinkers have come up with theories. Utilitarianism is the most simple example, right? Remember, we need a bridge. We need a bridge from empirical claims to normative claims, right? So think about it in terms of what is that bridge? The bridge is an understanding of happiness. It's a very convincing kind of bridge because, the utilitarians say, look, the basic point of life is to be happy. Everyone strives to be happy. And let's not dispute that anymore. Let's not argue about that, right? We have to accept that, okay? Which seems compelling. Seems like a good place to start. Everyone wants to be happy, right? And so we can study the facts, right? We can study people's situations. We can study laws, and we can determine which of these situations, which of these facts, which of these policies is going to lead to more people being happy, right? And then we can confidently assert that, for example, you ought to change the law so that blah, 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 because more people are happy, right? And then we have a normative claim, and it comes out of a simple scientific analysis of the facts, right? And the assumption, it just seems a sound, valid assumption, that every person strives for happiness, right? That's the telos. Utilitarianism is actually sometimes described as another teleological theory. It's much more simple, right? It's much more easy to confirm. You can't confirm, the idea, for example, The most common natural law theory argument you'll encounter revolves around, deals with human sexuality, right? And the whole debate about marriage equality and stuff like that. And scientifically, it's just impossible to prove the purpose of one's sexual organs or the purpose of romance, right? The purpose of sexual relationships. It's impossible to prove that scientifically. And so, you know, anyway, why was I talking about that? All right. Anyway, let's just move on. We got a lot of stuff to get through. Okay, do they commit them? They might. They might, all right? They insist, Schweizerian ethicists, some facts in nature are value facts, all right? It's a fact that trees benefit from sunlight, water, and soil. Salmon value gravel beds and oxygen-rich water, right? And Schweizerian ethicists tend to describe the genetic structures of plants, animals as simultaneously normative structures, all right? Genes define not just what is, but also what ought to be. Schweitzer argues that refusing to recognize such value facts amounts to committing an anthropocentrist fallacy. Okay? So this is something to think about. This is the key metaethical question. Do value facts exist in a nature devoid of human consciousness? Schweitzer says yes. All metaethical objectivists say yes. All right? The claim that intrinsic value and thus some sort of moral status is objectively real and knowable in nature is the hallmark of metaethical objectivism. All right, then we went through, you know, it turns out I went through all this material about salmon and I decided not to, but we might use this for our final exam. I'm starting to think more and more that we will use the salmon and the orcas for our final exam. Now that'll be our moral struggle problem. So this very, very fascinating story though. These Puget Sound, the southern resident orcas, right? You've got your transients, you've got your southern residents, and you've got your northern residents, right? The northern resident orcas all live around Queen Charlotte Islands, you know, 100 miles north of Puget Sound or so. But all three groups, they come near each other. They don't interact, they don't really hang out with each other at all. They don't interbreed, they don't even talk to each other. And they have different dietary habits too. Very different diets. But, so anyway, the transients cruise up and down the coast, right? And I think they tend to do their family, you know, their family life is farther south, right? Off the coast of southern, maybe Baja California even. And then the northern residents, they hang out up by the Queen Charlotte Islands, and then the southern residents, but they all eat food, you know, off the coast. And the southern residents, I'm not sure what the northern residents eat, but the southern residents eat primarily salmon, primarily Chinook salmon. Their diet, 78% Chinook salmon, almost all of which originates from the Snake River watershed. All right, so removing those 4 lower Snake dams has, you know, all these effects besides just restoring our salmon populations. The transients, I know, they eat primarily small marine mammals. They generally don't eat fish. Very interesting, isn't it? So anyway, when these scientists were debating in the 90s, I think the decision to list the southern resident, these Puget Sound orcas, under the Endangered Species Act was made in 2005. Okay, so 11 years ago. And they started debating this, you know, in the 90s. And on one side were scientists who were saying, no, these guys, you know, orca populations, there are orca populations in every ocean in the world. And these guys are not genetically different. You know, we've examined their genes and they're not genetic. And then on the other side were scientists who were saying that no. These southern resident orcas, they speak a different language. They have different dietary practices. They only interact, there are 3 pods, right? They interact with each other, but they don't interact with the transients. They don't interact with the northern residents, right? And they, for cultural reasons, not our cultural reasons, but their cultural reasons, they ought to be listed because they have a distinct culture, even though they're genetically almost identical, right? 99.99999% identical, right? They're culturally very different. And so under the Endangered Species Act, they were listed, I believe they're listed as threatened, not fully endangered, but threatened. For cultural reasons, because their culture is distinct. And that's the first time that any species was listed under the Endangered Species Act because its culture is different than other populations, which is really kind of fascinating. There are a lot of parallels. I mentioned the lifespan is roughly the same between humans and orcas. And also orcas, interestingly enough, are one of only 3 mammal species thus far whose female members have been identified, are known to undergo menopause, with menopause being defined as a period of, you know, fairly long period of 10, 20, 30 years, where the female is reproductively not viable. And it would make sense, you know, that would seem to be an evolutionary disadvantage for most animals, right? To have extra mouth, to have all these mouths to feed who aren't reproducing, right? But so it was a bit of a puzzle for evolutionary historians to figure out. Of course, we'll never really know, why did this happen? How come humans have? Do you have the answer?
Kind of. In evolution class last term, it's the matriarchal pods, and the older females actually lead their offspring. So their progeny live on
yes.
at greater
Grandmas
rates.
are a genetic adaptation that's advantageous.
And they're the
right.
salmon-eating ones.
And I think it's the pilot whale, it's another cetacean, and then the humans. The humans, the pilot whales, and the orcas are the only three that have humans. The pilot whales are, orcas and pilot whales are both dolphins, by the way. They're not really whales, but because they're so big. Animals in the ocean get bigger. Do you guys know that? Because there's less gravity. Isn't that interesting? I learned that just a couple weeks ago. The largest living thing on the planet is a redwood tree. But even its top height is like 300 feet, just because gravity prevents the water. Trees have to get water all the way up to their uppermost branches, right? And it's too hard for so they're limited at about 3. Isn't that interesting? Gravity limits the size, but in the ocean there's less gravity, and so some animals get a lot bigger. So it makes sense, right? The whale, is way, way, way bigger than any kind of animal on land. What's the largest land animal? I don't know. Maybe an elephant.
Yeah,
we'll see. And whales some whales are way, like 10 times bigger than elephants. So anyway, so it's just fascinating stories, about these orcas, and my heart just goes out to them. There are 3 factors contributing to their decline. Lack of food is the big one, and then pollutants. Estimated, some people have looked into this, and it would cost a lot of money, like $10 billion or more, just to clean up the Puget Sound. But evidently, their bodies, this is partly due to emaciation and all the toxic pollutants in their water. But their bodies are just filled, right, with all kinds of, because they're apex predators, right? Just like we are. All these PCBs and nasty things build up in their fat, and it's very hard for them to give birth to healthy babies. Although recently some babies have been born, people are happy about that. All right, we don't need that. So again, Charles Darwin plays an important role, very crucial. I guess we're ready to go into E.O. Wilson now. And let's see, there's our midterm from last term. But that's not this term. So anyway, I'm sorry, I should have cut that out. Because now some people who aren't in class, they think that's, but anyway.